Never mind Trump losing the election. America's next civil war has already started. This is how it will end. So saith the Independent. The Times has a poll. Quarter of Americans fear civil war after the election. And we have this from the Washington Post, our deepening cold civil war. From Wired, online talk about civil war could inspire real world violence, DHS warns cops. And then, of course, from the Washington Examiner, fear of election violence, civil war surge. All of these stories dropping. Now, first, I will say, perhaps it is the uncertainty. It is the fear of violence on every side of this political battle, be it just the left or the right, or if you want to include other fringe factions. Perhaps just fear. Nothing will really happen. Maybe a couple of media outlets realized, hey, look, we can get a lot of clicks if we say civil war. Or maybe there is some truth to the feeling that people have that something is going to happen. Rudyard Lynch runs a YouTube channel called What If Alt History. And he studies history every day. He makes amazing videos. Many find him to be particularly fascinating. We had him on Timcast IRL, and he made a prediction. He says that he has a standing bet, 1,000 dead by April for $1,000. It's shocking, I guess. It's hard to believe. I mean, I don't even believe it. And I'm the guy who's talking about the risks and the fears of civil war all the time, right? It's hard to believe because of optimism bias and normalcy bias. But yes, maybe there is a reality here. Rudyard says that there will be domestic political violence following the election, which will result in 1,000 dead by April. And the examples that he cites are basically every revolution and civil war ever. Now, a lot of people look at what's going on in this country and they think it can't happen. The word that we see coming up from all of the experts is civil war. But perhaps there is an easier way to explain all of this. Revolution. The revolution is not necessarily going to be like the founding fathers standing up and saying, we deserve to be free of a king and govern ourselves. Revolution just means that the government changes. And revolution doesn't require two large factions fighting over control of one government. If this country sees a political crisis that results in mass violence and the ultimate toppling of the government, or the replacement or a coup or leadership change, I mean, it's a revolution. The structures may remain in place, but different people with different ideas may seize control. We don't know. So maybe civil war isn't the right way to describe it. And the only reason we are saying civil war is because we believe that this conflict will come to a head with two factions. But what if the right refuses to be involved? What if the right says, we're not going to fight over this? Then it's a revolution, the left wins. What if the left tries to break away and form their own structures of governance, and the right then says, we will use the power of government to stop you from doing it? Say they have the West Coast states secede from the Union, which is something they have suggested back in 2020. Now, as Democrats, then maybe you could call it a civil war, separatist movement. I don't know. What I can say is there is real and legitimate concern for political violence. And there are many scenarios that could lead us to this position. That is, Donald Trump wins, and it looks like he will, but Democrats refuse to accept this. They'll claim that he cheated. They'll say that under the 14th Amendment, he's disqualified and he can't run anyway. The Supreme Court is corrupt and was stacked by Trump himself. I don't know. What I can tell you is it's not my idea. The corporate press is pumping out these articles. And like I said, maybe they're just thinking we'll score a quick couple million views on these articles that will make us some money right before an election. Or maybe there is some truth to what this country is about to face. Several years ago, this is now about, I'd say 6 years ago, I was part of some group chats based on DC politicos and writers and reporters sharing information. And when I was talking about the possibility and potentials of civil war, as I had read these articles in the news and agreed with them, there were many pundits, politicos, journalists that were based in D.C. that scoffed at the idea and told me, Tim, you're ridiculous. This is never going to happen. The security state would never allow such a thing. It's fascinating because the perception was, though Donald Trump was president, he had no power whatsoever, and his supporters had no power whatsoever. Yet here we are. I remember we had one episode of Timcast IRL where Ryan Long came on the show. Well, actually, Ryan Long came on the show and we talked Civil War. And then he came on again later. And right when the show starts, says, hey, Tim, where's the Civil War? You had me when I was leaving last time. I was pretty shaken up, and now here we are. Where's the Civil War? You said was going to happen, and I said on January 6th, 1,000 Trump supporters stormed into the Capitol and disrupted the electoral college vote count, and the Democrats have called that an insurrection and now impaneled a group of Democrats to start going after Republican politicians. There are hundreds of people being arrested and locked up in solitary confinement. Right? And I'm not saying January 6th was an insurrection. I'm saying look at the escalation that is happening right in front of our eyes. It's plain as day. Now, before I read the articles, I do want to say one more thing. The other day I mentioned I do believe civil war is inevitable for one simple reason. Republicans and Democrats operate already under two different systems of governance. Neither agrees with the other. On the right, you have the election day as prescribed by the Constitution. That is, there is one day by which we all go out and vote. We're done. We see who wins. The Democrats live in a world where you can just collect ballots throughout the month and even after Election Day, and they'll decide when the election is over. I kid you not. I mean, it sounds shockingly insane, doesn't it? We say today's the day we cast our ballots. We're going to count how many votes there are. Whoever wins, wins. That's what we're saying, the quote unquote right. On the Democrat side, they're saying ballots may come in after Election Day and we intend to count them. Well, hold on. That means we don't have an election day. It means you're just saying, just send in the ballots whenever. And then we'll see if we want to count them. These are two different systems of governance in choosing who our leaders are. That's an impossibility. Republicans reject the mail-in voting and absentee ballot system. However, as the right often does, they capitulate to the left, which does not bode well for them. Right now, Republicans have taken the lead in North Carolina in early voting slightly, and they've made tremendous gains in other swing states, indicating that by Election Day, Republicans may actually win. But I don't know if that actually matters. Instead, what we're seeing is that Republicans have capitulated to the system of governance of the left that the right never agreed to at a legislative level. The Constitution certainly doesn't say we can count ballots after Election Day. That's insane. Democrats just made that up. So what makes any Republican think that even if they participate in early and absentee voting, as Democrats have demanded and mandated without legal precedence, without legal order, what makes them think they can win when Democrats bring in votes after Election Day to count? No, look, you engage in early and mail-in voting and they just look at the number and they can say, don't worry, we just need to bring in slightly more votes in the week or two after the election as Republicans allow. And they do. So I say this doesn't bode well for Republicans, but it does indicate that these two systems, they can't coexist. Unless, of course, Republicans just let the Democrats do it as they tend to. In which case, you will get a revolution. With DEI in this country, you've got chief diversity officers in numerous businesses functioning much like the Chinese Communist Party does in their country. You will get a revolution. We'll see. But let me read this from The Independent. And we'll talk about what's going on. Is there actually going to be a civil war? So smash that like button, share the show with everyone you know. Follow me on X and Instagram at Timcast. And of course, leave us a good review on the audio podcast. Let's read. The Independent writes, when Stephen Marsh began writing a book that imagined a future civil war in the United States of America, he repeatedly found himself having to throw out large chunks of text because the very things he conjured on the page suddenly started happening in real life. Sheriffs across the country refusing to obey federal law. Stop! Stephen! Well, come on. That's been going on in Democrat states for quite some time as it pertains to marijuana and illegal immigration. So what does this have to do with today? It's not a new thing. Maybe you should read the news and pay attention. He goes on to say, white power groups getting their hands on nuclear material. The right is not represented by white power groups. So if a fringe faction of lunatics gets a nuke, that's just terrorism and everyone disagrees with it. Marsh soon realized the civil war he was predicting had, in a way, already begun. Stephen Marsh sees a lot of things. I've had several conversations with him. He sees a lot of things that I see. However, he lives in the deluded, false world of the corporate press that Donald Trump is a white supremacist and he supports these people. It's just laughably absurd. White power groups getting their hands on nuclear material in no way aligns with the current iteration of the right in this country. Unless, of course, you live in wacko world and you have no idea what's really going on. They're going to say there is something in the air, in the streets, even in our screens, in the form of Alex Garland's recent film Civil War, which wasn't a Civil War movie, by the way, which imagines a dystopian future. The American presidency has become a dictatorship and rebels descend on the White House. And with the new, actually, I would say in the movie, they don't actually describe anything political, so we don't know what happened. with a new poll in the Times showing that now more than a quarter of American adults believe that civil war could break out after this year's presidential election. It feels like Garland's imagined future could be closer than we think. Marsh says that when the first civil war happened in the 1860s, very few people in America saw it coming. He is correct. Even when the first battle began at Fort Sumter near Charleston, South Carolina, there is a quote near the beginning of his book, The Next Civil War, from a retired Army colonel who says that a new American Civil War would not be like the first one with armies maneuvering on the battlefield. I think it would be very much be a free-for-all, neighbor on neighbor based on beliefs in skin colors and religion, and it would be horrific. Now, this person is incompetent with that quote. There's literally no reality right now where my neighbor who is Latino and my neighbor who is black are going to be neighbor on neighbor attacking each other based on race or religion. That's an absurdity. There is no reality where the right, largely led by Donald Trump, attacks Muslim groups. That's just not going to happen. Unless, of course, the left rallies Muslim groups and attacks the right. That is maybe. But in that case, I would not say it's based on religion or skin color, but ideology and political faction. I believe this quote is wrong. Marsh, who is Canadian and lives with his wife and children in Toronto, says that if you look at the U.S. today, it's really not too hard to imagine. There are more guns than people. 1 out of every 11 presidents has been assassinated. In his book, Marsh writes that it's not surprising the U.S. Secret Service spends $1 million a day on keeping the president alive. He details the unrest around Black Lives Matter movement, anti-government extremists, Boogaloo Boys arming themselves to the teeth. Of course, the Boogaloo Boys are anti-government, but they're not aligned with any faction. They've even praised, individuals aligned with Boogaloo Boys have praised Antifa and conservatives. And small communities in the Pacific Northwest sealing themselves off in communes, claiming they don't recognize the law. He describes states like Texas fighting the federal government over laws governing America's southwest border and so-called lone wolf terrorists like Dylan Roof, who killed 9 black churchgoers in Charleston, South Carolina in 2015. That's what chaos looks like. And so a new civil war is the sort of thing we've already seen, only much, much more continuous and much more unstoppable. I don't completely disagree. I don't know that it's fair to say that's the civil war. It's just chaos and unrest. That happens in almost every single country around the world. We've just lived in a golden age. It doesn't seem that far-fetched, especially when you consider that the majority of Republicans believe the 2020 election was stolen. And let's not forget that majority of the Democrats believe the 2016 election was stolen. Y'all live in wacko world. That's not a fringe minority. There was already a constitutional legitimacy crisis in the United States. Agreed. Despite the obvious assumption that the touch paper that ignited all this was January 6, it wasn't. Blah, blah, blah. Marsh says the malaise has been brewing for years. When I talked to legal and political experts, the date that kept coming up was 2008. Because the housing crisis that year was where you started to see fundamentally the real death of the middle class. At the end of the notion that every generation was going to do better than the generation that came before it. I agree. That's when we saw the emergence of the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street. Now, hold on. You may be saying that we didn't see Tea Party Occupy in 2008. No. But the financial crisis and the bailing out of big banks and powerful elites triggered angry people on the left and the right towards populist movements, which manifested in the next few years. Those major movements were the crack in the facade, which ultimately led to the rise of Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump in 2016. Bernie, of course, is weak and bent the knee, but Donald Trump smashed through the gates like a bull in a china shop. He says, Trump is very much a symptom, not a cause. He is correct. The underlying problems in the U.S. are huge. Inequality, a massive decline of trust in the legal system, a hyper-partisan duopoly between the two parties, which creates election victories rather than plans for the future. He is absolutely correct. And also a decrepit and dysfunctional constitution that is nonetheless worshipped as a religious document, even though it doesn't really apply to the 21st century. He is completely incorrect. And this is a Canadian living under a boot of Trudeau, so I'm not surprised. Would love to absolutely have Marsh back out because our conversations, I think, are really good despite our disagreements. The good news is that Marsh believes there are ways to stop this decline in digital chaos and untethered unrest. The U.S. could, for example, assemble a constitutional convention to update its founding documents. Separation, the aim of the Confederate States during the U.S. Civil War, is highly unlikely, but would offer a way out. No, it would not. The most realistic scenario, he believes, is to begin having open primaries. Primaries are the mechanism by which voters choose their preferred candidates. We know this. Currently, primaries are partisan affairs in which only Democrats and Republicans can vote in their respective elections. Open primaries, on the other hand, would lead to much more reasonable human beings being in government. No, it wouldn't. They inevitably get more centrist people elected because the lunatics honestly do not represent the will of the American people. Democrats tried to get Nikki Haley elected, she would actually drive this country closer to civil war because the majority of the populist movement opposes her warmongering behaviors. But if Democrats sabotage the Republicans by putting in Nikki Haley, who they think will lose, Republicans sabotage the Democratic primaries by putting in a candidate they think will lose, you'd end up with two deeply unpopular candidates and everyone pissed off. Case in point, Egypt twice 10 years ago. Perhaps Stephen Marsh could do some research on these other countries and what happens when you have a plurality or a majority of people who oppose the sitting elected leader. For those that aren't familiar, in Egypt, they had a revolution. This was, I believe, 2012. And what ended up happening was after the removal of, I believe it was Mubarak, they held elections. I don't know the exact number, but what I was told when I was there on the ground and interviewing people during the second revolution was that the largest single voting bloc in the country was the Muslim Brotherhood. But they were a minority in the country. The majority of people in the country were secular. They just didn't agree on which person should be elected. They did not want religious theocracy. Unfortunately for them, if each individual group can only muster 10% of the vote, but the Muslim Brotherhood can muster 15, then the Muslim Brotherhood wins. And they did. This pissed off a lot of people. So what happened? A second revolution right away, where they removed the duly elected government because it was a minority government nobody wanted, but an extreme minority government. This resulted in the military taking action and massacring members of the Muslim Brotherhood because they knew as the single largest voting bloc, they would win any election they were in. And thus, catastrophe, military rule. Now, in the United States, if you have open primaries and it's Nikki Haley versus Joe Biden, everyone's pissed. The left is pissed because they don't like Israel and Joe Biden's bad. The right is pissed because Nikki Haley's a warmonger. And you will get populist uprising once again and the removal of people from government. No one's going to sit back and accept a deeply unpopular. I'm saying deeply unpopular. If Donald Trump wins and he doesn't get the popular vote, he may be a minority government, but still a massive amount of people support him. Democrats could potentially try and rise up against that, but it's still only going to be a small faction of Democrats that are willing to engage in any kind of untoward behavior. But if you get a politician with only 20% support and you end up with Republicans and Democrats unified and you crack that plurality, heck, you get 30, 40% of people who are opposed to it, you could see real revolution. He goes on to say, in the immediate future, at least, that doesn't look likely because as Marsh points out, it's not in the interest of either Democrats or Republicans. We'll skip to the bottom so we can get to other articles. He says, but Marsh notes, hope still sells. Almost as a postscript to the next Civil War, he writes, none of the crises described in the book are beyond the capacity of Americans to solve. Perhaps. Then we have this poll from the Times. Quarter of Americans fear civil war after election. Just a quarter. Most people don't. But they say fears that an eruption of violence is very or somewhat likely are shared across the political divide by 20% of American adults, including 30% of women, 24% of men. Okay, let me put it this way. How many people in this country actively pay attention to what's going on? Very few. That means that the people who do care are largely the political individuals, the individuals who are watching shows like this. Interesting. Washington Post says our deepening cold civil war, election day won't be the end of our political stalemate. Can the country bend without breaking? Wired says online talk about civil war could inspire real world violence. You see, this is the silliest thing ever. That it is that we talk online about it and it could lead to real world violence. You fundamentally misunderstand former Vice News reporter Tess Owen, who is a far leftist. People are talking about civil war because the sentiment exists, not because they've decided to randomly talk about it on the internet. The idea here is that real world violence could be inspired by people online talking about civil war, and that's silly. People are talking about civil war because of existing real world violence. Aaron Danielson shot twice in the chest by a Black Lives Matter activist with a BLM tattoo on his neck. Provo, Utah, BLM activist ran up to a car and shot the driver for no reason. You've got the Chaz Chop. You've got the George Floyd Autonomous Zone. You've got the Atlanta Autonomous Zone. Far leftists seizing territory in major U.S. cities for weeks on end, sometimes longer. People getting killed there. And then online, when people see these stories, they say, I fear civil war. And the response, of course, from the crackpot left is, well, this certainly just is because of the conversations online. Spare me. Indeed, it is not. Back in 2018, when I was talking about civil war, it's because we had major street violence. Thousands of people on the left clashing with thousands of people on the right beating each other in the streets. And the pundits and politicos in D.C. said, street violence is meaningless. And where are we now? The Washington Examiner says, the nation's largest network of survival camps is urging its members to spend election day inside its guarded fences due to growing concerns about political violence and civil war. Fortitude Ranch, which has several established and planned off-the-grid prepper resorts, issued its call after pollsters reported surging fears of violence from the losing side in the next month's presidential election. Next month's, yeah, less than 2 weeks. Quote, if you are a Fortitude Ranch Survival Community member, they are going to be open on Election Day so members who are in areas of high risk or post-election protest violence can take refuge. Fortitude Ranch staff does not consider the likelihood of immediate post-election violence or civil war to be high, but there is a strong likelihood of some violence by the 50% or more of the population that will be very angry with the November 5th results. The election results are likely to be contested, and there could be weeks of protest and post-election violence. There is no way to predict how violent or widespread this could become. But it could quickly develop and get out of control. If police are tied up with public protests, gang members and criminals know this is an ideal time for them to loot. If this post-election violence is bad and looting takes off, there is a chance that it could escalate into home invasions and marauding. Election-related violence occurred after both of the last two presidential elections in 2017, after Trump was inaugurated. Angry protesters damaged parts of downtown D.C. In 2021, there was the storming of the Capitol. The riots. A new Rasmussen report survey confirmed that many likely voters see a similar situation in this election. Rasmussen said 43% believe that a civil war was likely. 45% don't. The rest are unsure. And while the liberal media has said that Trump and his supporters are to blame for the fear of violence, Rasmussen said most believe Democrats are the worst enemy. Well, I don't know or care. I can only tell you this. Be prepared. Do you have food? Do you have water? Safeandreadymeals.com. Good luck. Have you trained with firearms? Have you gone to safety classes? I'm not suggesting you do anything. I'm just saying, do you know how to take care of yourself? Perhaps you need firearms training for hunting. If the roads get shut down and there's no food, maybe you need to get your hunting permits in order and make sure you take care of yourself. Do you have any chickens? Yeah. Well, maybe you don't. Maybe you should get some. They're funny. They'll make you laugh. And every day they will give you a fresh egg. And then the best part is they make more of themselves. Just make sure you can maintain them. I don't know what you're doing, buying gold and silver, whatever it may be. I don't know what happens in 2 weeks. Nobody does. In 2020, I predicted that things would get crazy. I said on a show, on my morning show, that people would go nuts and storm the White House or something like that on November 6th. Who knows? I was wrong. Nobody stormed the White House. It wasn't until January 6th that Trump supporters, many of them protested, rioted, and broke their way into the Capitol. Many of them also were let in and just walked around confused. That's true as well, but there was a lot of angry people. I don't know where things go after this, but I tell you, January 6th was still a scary day. Now, I understand it's not an insurrection. Nobody had any real plans, and a lot of people are bumbling about. That's fair. Police escorted the shaman to the Senate chambers, and they were being polite for the most part, though many were violent, fighting with cops and smashing things. The reality is, on that day, as we sat there staring at people breaking windows and entering that building, we did not know what was going to happen. And that fear and uncertainty, well, that's worrying. We don't know where we go this time. All that matters is you are able to take care of your family. So I hope you're paying attention. I have no answers for you. I'll leave it there. Follow me on X and Instagram at Timcast. Share the show with everyone you know. We're 12 days away. Stay safe. Thanks for hanging out. We'll see you all in the next segment.